Good morning again. I think we're fairly short of time, Marlene, are we? So I'm going to move fairly swiftly through talking about the ups and downs of randomised trials. And what I've chosen is three what I think are important aspects of running RCTs. Identifying the outcomes first of all, estimating the sample size correctly, and then I'm going to tell you a few stories at the end about the importance of collaboration based on some practical experiences I've had in RCTs. Before that, I'll just give you a tiny bit of background about Southern Ireland. At least you know where it is, whereas most people when I talk in international audiences don't. We have 4 million people, 63,500 births, and a high rate of intervention. Just as an example, our caesarean section rate there doubled in the last 12 years from 12% to 24%. And that's due to what I call the economic model of childbirth, where women are progressed through a conveyor belt with a lot of unnecessary, sometimes, intervention. And because of that, I carry out RCTs, because what I'm looking at is the interventions to see, are they necessary, are they unnecessary? And particularly by examining their advantages and disadvantages, you can see whether they should or should not be used and for which women. Now, before I continue on, I'd like to know which of these 4 categories you belong to, so that I have some idea of where to pitch the talk. So, how many of you are conducting or have conducted an RCT? Oh dear, look at that. Okay, you guys can go to sleep, all right? The next one, I know in the basics in theory about RCTs. Lovely, okay, that's more like it. I know very little about running RCTs. Even better, good, oh yeah, good. They're the ones I want in the audience. And then the ones I want most about, I know nothing about RCTs and or I'm scared stiff. Did you have your hand up before for the, I have run an RCT, yeah? Yeah, you've run an RCT, therefore you're now scared stiff. Yeah, join the club. Okay, that's great. That's actually fairly evenly split, but anyway. Very briefly, you all know RCTs involve control and experimental groups. You can have either one or more. People are randomly allocated to them for fairness and justice, preferably blinded, which I find is very difficult usually, particularly for things doing with midwifery, because the women can tell or the midwives can tell what they're getting. Blinding usually works only when you're handing out little white tablets to people, and it's easy to do it then. Inferential tests are used to test the hypothesis, which is usually a null hypothesis, and you use intention to treat analysis. So if you've randomized somebody to group A and they develop a problem and have to move to group B for a treatment, they then get analysed as being part of group A still, even though they've had part A and part B treatment. As I go through, I'll be talking at some stages about the mid-use study as well as others. And just that you're aware that anytime I do that, I want to acknowledge very strongly the team that worked with me on that. Declan Devan, my research assistant, and Mike Clark, who's the Cochrane, he works on the Cochrane collaboration. The women involved have been absolutely superb, and the HSE Northeast for the funding that they provided for it. I'm just going to show you the randomisation that took place for the mid-use study. We started off with a group of healthy women without risk factors for pregnancy and labour, therefore suitable for midwifery-led care. They all received information about the study and they consented to participate. They were then randomised on a 2-to-1 ratio. Now that's different to the usual 1-to-1, okay? So that for every 3 women, 2 women were randomised to the MLU and 2 to consultant-led care. And the reason for that was we, the HSE, had put in a lot of money and time and trouble and expense into developing the midwifery-led units, you know, strengthening the floor, putting in the water pools, putting in extra staff and so on. So to be cost effective, they wanted to get some use out of their money, as it were. So we wanted more women in the midwifery-led arm. And also, the women who joined the study, by definition almost, wanted MLU care. So that we wanted to disappoint as few women as possible. And it actually makes very little difference to the sample size. You have to have a couple of hundred more, but not very much. It's amazing it doesn't actually affect the stats too much. So the stage we're at the moment, the trial ceased over a year ago, and we've been collecting up the outlying data, and we're just about to start analysing the outcomes and comparing the 2 groups. So that's how the randomisation works in an RCT. I talked before about how you have a hypothesis. It's usually a null hypothesis, which means it's based on the assumption that there's no relationship between the variables. So what we were saying for the mid-use study is there is no relation, there is no difference between the midwifery-led care and consultant-led care in XYZ outcomes. And I'll talk about those in a moment when we're building on the sample size. The inferential tests then provide evidence whether or not this hypothesis can be rejected. And I'm sure you're aware that when you say, I have rejected the null hypothesis, that's good. It means there is a difference between the two arms, okay? Kind of always sounds negative, but it's actually the way you probably in your biased fashion want it to turn out. Random allocation then ensures that each participant has an equal chance of having either the old or the new treatment. And that's coming from the ethical principle of fairness and justice, that people have the equal opportunity to be in either. It also ensures that you can't predict the group in advance. So I, the researcher, can't decide I'm going to plonk you into group A or group B because I think you'd get on better there. And likewise, the participant can't choose which one they'd like to have. But overall those, most importantly, it ensures that confounding variables, things that might affect the outcome, are going to be equally distributed between the two groups, so that any difference you find then in the end, you can say is truly due to the actual intervention that you've put in. The only trouble with that is that by chance, there may be some participants, there may be more of them in one group than the other that have a confounding variable. And the only way to make sure that doesn't happen is to have your trial large enough. And we'll be going on later on to talk about what is large enough and how can you estimate that sample size. If you can imagine, if you just allocated 10 people to each group, you'd end up with one confounding variable higher in one group than the other. If you randomly allocated 100 to each group, the two groups would be nearer. And if you randomly allocate maybe 1,000, they'll be equal. Whatever your confounding variable is, it'll be equal. So it's to find out, is it a couple of hundred or is it 1,000 that you need in your sample size? That's why you need to work it out. And we'll be dealing with that in a few moments. But for that, very, very important, you need to choose your outcomes. Now, with the mid-use study, we settled on 3 primary outcomes, and then we have a zillion secondary outcomes that we're also looking at, but we're powering the study on those first 3. And the important thing is to choose which ones are important to you and why. Now, if you're ever going to choose outcomes for a study, please refer to Devan, Begley, Clark, Horry, and O'Boyle's paper on the minimum data set for outcome measures. This was a Delphi study that Declan led and was conducted internationally. We had obstetricians, midwives, consumers, all kinds of people, sociologists, anybody who was interested in maternity care, took part in a 3-round Delphi to find out what was the minimum data set that every study should involve. And the other thing that you need to think about when you're choosing your outcomes is not only the statistical significance, which is what you're going to make sure you reach, by having the right sample size, but the clinical significance. Because you might otherwise choose an outcome that, yes, you'll find a difference, but does anybody care? And that would be a big shame. To give you an example of what I mean, if I hark back to a very old study that I carried out, and this was not an RCT, it was, I suppose nowadays it would be called action research, but anyway, I don't like that term, but anyway. I did a study looking at episiotomy rates in midwives practice, and then I gave them loads of information from the literature about, how we shouldn't be doing episiotomies quite as frequently as we were, and then I carried out a second study to see was there any change. And those 2 studies together resulted in a halving of episiotomy rates in the study site, and that was statistically significant. If you see the green figures there, the episiotomy rate, and this is primal gravity, went down from 54 to 34.5. The intact perineum rate rose, the first degree laceration rate rose, that's the little nicks and tears that didn't need suturing. But what everybody wanted to know was, okay, you've cut the episiotomy rate, sorry, that wasn't meant to be a pun, you have lowered the episiotomy rate, but have you increased the second degree laceration rate that needs sutures? In other words, do you end up with the same number of women with the same number of sore perineums with sutures in? And the answer was no. The second degree laceration rate was exactly the same. So all those extra episiotomies had been done into perineums that would have been intact or had a slight nick or tear. And they're just figures you can look at. Oh, I have handouts, lads. Actually, Marlene, would you mind handing out the handouts, because you will need them in a few moments to do a little bit of work. They're going to be made work shortly. Only can I ask you not to read ahead, if you don't mind, because you'll spoil the surprise that's coming later. The figures that will be there in your handout for the para 1s, and the para 2s right down at the bottom. Can you see the episiotomy rate went from 5% to 2%, and again intact perineum rate rose, first degree laceration rate rose, and in this instance, right down the bottom right hand corner, the second degree laceration rate fell significantly from 18% to 11%, which showed fairly conclusively that the more episiotomies midwives do, the more tears they also have, because they've stopped caring about perineums. So that was just an instance of where, yes, you might see a statistically significant difference in an episiotomy rate, but would it be clinically significant? It wouldn't have been clinically significant if we had ended up with more tears, okay? So that all the same number of women had sutures, but we didn't. It was also clinically significant as well as statistically. Another example of that from the third stage study, which was an RCT comparing active and physiological management of the third stage of labour. I'm just going to show you two of the results from that. In the active group that had IV ergometrine, the mean blood loss was 149 mLs, and in the physiological, the mean blood loss was 223 mLs. Now that's, what, 85 mLs difference. That's statistically significant, okay, quite highly significant. Is it clinically significant? Midwives in the audience, what do you think? Is that clinically significant that every woman would bleed 85 mLs more than the other women? Hands up who thinks it is clinically significant. Hands up who think it isn't. Depends on the mother's state. Okay. Just to help you, that's 85 mLs of blood. Okay? Are you happy that every woman bleeds that amount more when they're in the physiological arm? Yes. Yay. Good, 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 good. So my contention as a midwife is that this was statistically significant, but probably not clinically significant. Okay? It's a hard one to call, and some people will disagree with us. And as Marlene said, it does depend on the state of the woman. These women all had hemoglobins greater than 11 grams before we put them into the study. The other result to look at the length of the third stage. 11.3 minutes in the active, 11.6 minutes in physiological. Are you happy to spend 20 seconds on average more with every woman having physiological management? Yes or no? Yes. Absolutely. So is that clinically significant, that difference? No. Anybody think it is? No. Good, good, good. That's much more clear-cut, isn't it? Now, if I had powered the third stage study, or if I powered a future third stage study on length of third stage, that would be stupid. It would be a waste of time. Can you see that? Because yes, you may have such large numbers that you will get a statistically significant difference, but it means absolutely nothing. It makes no difference at all to the women or the mothers being 20 seconds longer in the third stage. So do you see what I mean about the importance of thinking about clinical significance before you start messing around with the statistics and thinking they're the be-all and the end-all? So going back to the mid-use study then, randomised controlled trial comparing midwifery-led with consultant-led care in the northeast area. To get our sample size, we need to decide on, first of all, the effect size, and that's the difference, like the 85 mLs difference, or the 54% episiotomy going down to 34%. It's that difference, the anticipated difference between the control and experimental, and it should be clinically significant. We then think about the level of statistical significance, and you're familiar with p-values, okay, and the power of the test. So we'll have a look at the three of those in turn. The effect size, first of all. Now, one of the primary outcomes we chose to base MIDU on was the difference in induction of labour rates, because we were looking at interventions, okay, and that's a fairly common intervention. The induction rate in the hospitals we were looking at in the North Eastern Health Board was 23%, so that's our control group, the normal, what the rate is at the moment. And then we had to decide, well, what difference are we prepared to say is clinically significant? So would you be prepared to say that a difference falling from 23% to 22% was clinically significant? Yes or no? No. 21%? No. 20%? No. 19%? The no's are getting quieter here. How many think going down from 23 to 19 is clinically significant? Hands up good and high, don't be shy. I love the Irish, they're so brave. Good, good. Okay. 18%, going down from 23% to 18%. Now how many think it's clinically significant? Much more hands up. And that includes the people who thought 19% was significant as well, okay? Because if you think 19% is significant, then you think 18% is. So hands up again, 23% to 18%. Loads of people, lovely. 23% to 17%, is that clinically significant? And including the 18 and the 19? Okay, loads more. And 16 and 15. Okay, phew. Because what we chose was 23% to 17%. And that was on a straw poll of midwives in the area. What did they feel was a significant difference? We also chose a episiotomy difference of 7% from 31 down to 21, 24. and augmentation of labour, 24% down to 18%. So they were our three outcomes actually for mid-year, is what we powered the study on, and then we had the zillion other secondary outcomes. The next thing we had to look at was the alpha level, and the normal is p less than 0.05. That means we're willing to accept a 5% probability of falsely rejecting the null hypothesis, which is known as a type 1 error. There's quite a bit of argument in the literature at the moment, and Mike Clark, one of my colleagues on MIDU, is strongly of the view you should usually go for 0.01 just to be on the safe side. That means you're 99 times out of 100 certain that you're not falsely rejecting the null hypothesis. We chose 0.05. It is the norm. It's accepted widely in medical and nursing midwifery circles, and it means we didn't have to have 3,000 women in our study. The power of the test is the ability of the test to avoid making a type 2 error, which is accepting the null hypothesis when it should be rejected. Now you need to think a little bit more carefully about this one. If death is the result when you get it wrong, then your power should be 99, all right? If there's very little difference to people, which sometimes happens, say you're trialing two different types of intervention, or sorry, not intervention, education, something like that, you know, nothing much will go wrong. It would be a pity if it went wrong, but nothing much would worry. Then you could go down as low as a power of 70. In generally, it's 80 or 80 plus in human trials. So we chose greater than or equal to 80. So the sample size for MIDU ended up with 1,500 using alpha of 5%, sufficient power greater than 80, and those three outcome measures that we talked about with those effect sizes. So that's how you work it out, step by step, starting off with what is clinically significant, okay? Very, very important. Just to give you an idea of how your sample size varies when you vary the effect and power sizes, we're going to do a little bit of work. See there's the table in your handouts there, because you're going to have to start filling in numbers in a minute. This is based on a sample size estimation paper that Declan, myself and Mike Clark wrote some time ago for the Journal of Advanced Nursing, and I have a copy of it here actually for all of you if you're interested, because it goes through it step by step for you. This was based on a study looking at perineal pain, which was at 62%, and saying that reducing that by 10%, a 10% effect size, would be clinically significant. Okay? Setting the power at 80%, setting the alpha at 5%, the two kind of fairly standard ones, and that gives you a sample size of 384. So we're going to look at how, if you mess around with those figures, how will your sample size vary? Changing the effect size first of all. Now, you all had your coffee, all right? Are you wide awake? Yeah. Hands up, anybody who's asleep? Okay. Yeah. They're awake now. So, if we change the effect size, we'll bring it down from 10% to 5%. Is your sample size going to go up or down? Hands up who thinks it's going to go up. Hands up who thinks it's going to go down. Really? Very good. 1,500. Now it goes way up. All right? That's quite an up. That's 1,000 up. 1,200 up. Let's have a look at some of the other figures. We'll go back to the 10% effect size. Okay? We're changing the power this time to 90 instead of 80. Now is the sample size going to go up or down? Up. People are getting more firm in their ideas now. Yep, going to go up. How much is it going to go up? As much as the effect size changing, or less, or more? Less? How much less? Will it go up from the 384? Will it go up 100, 200? Not very much. Okay, up to 513. What's that? 150 or so. Okay. So we'll go back to same thing, effect size of 10, still keeping the alpha the same, going up to 95 power this time. Are we going up or down? Up. How much up? About the same? Yeah. A little bit less, 120 or so instead of 150. Okay? Okay, next one. We'll go back to the 80% power, and this time we're going to mess around with the alpha. This is what Mike Clark would like people to do. Instead of having 5% alpha, go to the 1%. Now, from the 384, is that going to go up or down? Up, okay. How much up? Will it go up as much as the effect size, or as much as the power size changes? More than More than both of them. More than the power, sorry, yes. Okay. Nearly 200. You're a smart cookie. Okay. Now we've kept the alpha level at 1, so it's gone up from the 5. We've put the power up to 90. Is our sample size going to go up or down from 572? Up. How much up? About 100. 150. About 150. Okay, going up to 95 again. How much up is it going to go? Another 100 or so. 150-ish. Okay? So you can tell, you know, the power and the alpha put it up by 100, 120, 150-ish, that kind of amount. Now, for the final grand slam, we're going all out to do the really perfect study, okay? I'll talk about perfect in a minute. The alpha's up to 1%. Power is 95, all right? You're expecting death or something near death to come out of this if you get it wrong. And you've put the effect size down to 5 instead of 10. Now, how much is it going to go up this time? Because it's going to go up by sure, isn't it? More than 1,000, okay? Because you remember it went up to 1,500 before just by changing the effect size. 3,500, all right? So it actually goes up much more than you might think when you've changed everything. Okay, and that's why you don't have them quite as high as that. I talked a moment about perfect. There's no such thing as a perfect study, all right? And that's the first thing. You've got to accept imperfection in this life. You get as near to the truth as you can, you never get to the truth. With a study like that at the bottom, that you might say, if I had unlimited funds, it would be nice to do. No, it wouldn't. It might actually be unethical, all right? Because you're going too near perfection. And in fact, if you're doing the study properly, you'll have interim analyses as you go along, and you will get to a stage where you will find a statistically significant result in all your primary outcomes, and you will stop the trial before you get there. You won't need that number of people included. Okay, well done. Super duper duper duper. We should have music going with this. Are you happy with sample sizes? Do you feel you understood all that? As in, you don't have to do it just this minute, right? But you could understand it. When the statistician presses the buttons for you, you'll know what's going on. So, moving along. How am I for time? All right. You can relax a little bit now. Okay, this is going to be fun. I'm going to tell you some stories out of the mid-use study about collaboration. Okay, that was not meant to happen. Sorry. I'll just scroll back a wee bit. Okay, sorry, finger slipped on the wrong button. Lessons learned from past RCTs, particularly mid-U. When I put in the funding proposal for mid-U, I put in 6 months preparation time, as one does, because otherwise you don't get funded. And I knew in my heart and soul it would be a year, so I had myself organised for a year. When I went for the interview to discuss the funding, they were arguing me about the 6 months, and I said, no, it'll actually take a year. So they upped the funding at that stage, because, you know, even though they didn't believe it in the beginning, they were convinced. It actually took 2 years preparation time, and they funded the second year at no problem, because when we got into it, they realised themselves with the problems that have been going on in the northeast area. I don't know if you know about Drogheda and the consultants suspended and all that kind of thing. There were a lot of sensibilities to be taken into account. The obstetricians felt very, very threatened and needed to be helped to come on board and to understand that this was not another threat to them. So it took us 2 full years to prepare for this study. In all honesty, it wouldn't take that long anywhere else. It would only take a year. But it does take a year. And people who are funding these things need to be persuaded of that in the beginning. And that's because you need to collaborate and to talk to everybody. We had discussions with everyone: obstetricians, paediatricians, midwives, women, GPs, public health nurses, etc. And very importantly, we set up care process groups in each of the 2 hospitals. And these CPGs had subdivisions, subgroups within them, which form multidisciplinary guideline development groups that together worked with Declan, the research assistant to the project, in developing evidence-based guidelines for the medical ed unit. And that was important. He could have done it himself in half the time, but the important thing was working with the clinicians, having them on board, particularly the obstetricians, so that they felt safe and that they understood that the care that was being given to women would be safe. So just to have a look at how the guidelines were developed, the group was set up, the topics were selected, and even that took days and days of arguing. Declan carried out a systematic review of the literature on every single one of those guidelines, and we used the NICE guidelines obviously as a basis, but he had to go from square one as well in order that the clinicians had buy-in, had ownership of them. We formed the recommendations. There was loads of consultation and peer review. They were sent out 3 or 4 drafts to everybody on the care process groups. They were then presented in their final form, disseminated out. We got consumer feedback on it. They were implemented locally, audited and reviewed. And that's what took 2 years, okay, in case you think there was nothing going on during that time. Incredible amount of work and consultation with everybody. And during that time, there were challengers. It started off with the GPs. We hadn't quite realised that under the maternity and child scheme, the GPs get paid a certain amount of money for every mother who registers with them, whether or not she actually attends them then for antenatal or postnatal care. So the GPs were very upset that the women might go to the midwifery-led units and never come near them, and they'd miss out on their money. So we had to agree that every time a woman self-referred to the MLUs, we would refer them back to the GP just to go and knock on the door, sign in their name, so the GPs could get their money, and then they could come back to us and stay with us only if that's what they wanted. The obstetricians were very threatened because of the problems in the area, the fact that there had been a big report had come out, Our Lady of Lourdes report, that had slated the obstetricians, all of them, for not having whistleblown or not having, drawn the attention to the authorities of this obstetrician that had been running amok. So they felt very threatened, and they also felt that if anything went wrong in the MLUs, they would be held responsible. So it took a little bit of time and encouragement for them to realise that they were not responsible for midwifery care that was being given. It was only when the woman was transferred over that they then took up the responsibility for her. Public health nurses were very worried because they normally see each woman a day after she goes home, and that's the only postnatal care that was given in Ireland. 1 visit usually, maximum, unless there's a problem. And they felt that the midwives would be treading in their territory because the MLU midwives were going to go out daily for a week to look after these women. So again, we had to meet and negotiate with them, and we eventually agreed that we could go out and see the women every day for 1 week, and then the public health nurse will come on day 8 and do her statutory visit. Politicians, the 2 maternity units had been closed in the area, and there was a lot of adverse media publicity about babies dying on the side of the road and women not getting to hospital on time and so forth. And they felt that the MLUs were a second-rate option that was being given to them instead of their maternity unit, so they weren't very pleased about it either. DOHC officials have never ever come out in favour of the MLUs. They will not make a statement on it, but in private, verbally, they have not been very supportive about it at all. And the last 2 groups I'll talk about later, we didn't even think we should talk to them, which was maybe a mistake. We didn't think that physicians and surgeons were interested in MLUs, but there you are. That was a mistake. So the MLUs opened 2 years after we started the study, 5th of July 2004. And there was loads of very positive media publicity, okay? Everybody was thrilled to bits with everything that was going on. Loads of positive feedback, loads of praise from the women in the first couple of weeks. There was disappointment from the women who were allocated the CLU. Most of Declan's time was taken up answering the phone to women who said, I entered your study, but I've been allocated to the wrong arm. And there were loads of women outside the study requesting to join the MLU, which wasn't allowed. The health board had taken the view that they couldn't provide a service that was not based on evidence, therefore nobody could access the MLU unless they were in the study. And then, 3 weeks into the study, there was a flurry of activity. There was a letter from the chairman of the medical board in one of the hospitals on the 27th of July. There was a letter from the medical advisor of the NEHB to the CEO of the health board stating that this MLU was dangerous and should be stopped. And there were letters from the Institute of Obs and Gynae and the Medical Council saying that the study should be not allowed to start. They hadn't realised it had started because they were worried about the climate at the time and the obstetricians and so forth. Now, I won't deal with the other 2 letters at the bottom. I'll just briefly go through the letter from the chairman of the medical board. And as I said, I hadn't thought physicians and surgeons, had any interest in this. The chairman of the medical board it's just the group of all consultants in the hospital, which included the obstetricians. And the chairman happened to be a geriatrician. And he wrote a letter, which, I'll just quote a few sentences out of it, which said there was an absence of consultation and collaboration with the obstetrics department. before this study started. The study was unethical, it was seriously methodologically unsound, and the MLU in its current form was unsafe. This is after 2 years of minuted meetings with the obstetricians and paediatricians and neonatologists and GPs and public health nurses and all the rest, and having the guidelines, drawn up in consultation with everybody and sent to experts in the UK for their view, etc., etc. It was copied to the CEO, the Deputy CEO, the Assistant CEO of the North Eastern Health Board. It was copied to all members of the Drogheda and Cavan CPGs, that's all the clinicians, numbering 100 and something of them. The General Manager of Our Lady of Lourdes, the Director of Nursing of Our Lady of Lourdes, the Nurse Manager, which is what we call the person in charge of midwifery, the Medical Advisor, North Eastern Health Board, and the Maternity Services Manager in Cavan General Hospital. It was also copied to the Dean of Research, Trinity College, the Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences, TCD, my boss, the Chairperson of the Faculty of Health Sciences Ethics Committee in Trinity, the Chairperson of the TCD School of Nursing and Midwifery Ethics Committee, the Chairperson of the Maternity Services Task Force, the Registrar of the Irish Medical Council, the Head of Professional Standards, the Irish Medical Council, and the Chairperson of the Institute of Obs and Gynae, Royal College of Physicians in Ireland. So this was one very cross geriatrician who had written this letter and wanted everybody to know about it. So the response from ourselves was a letter enclosing full information refuting all the allegations. And lads, that was really easy to do. Okay, I mean, I know this sounds terribly threatening, and in some ways it was actually just very amusing. There was no stress involved in this at all, because we were absolutely sure that we were squeaky clean, and that's the lesson I'm trying to get over to you if you're doing RCTs. We had every sort of T crossed and I dotted on the ethical side and on the methodological side, and we knew we had collaborated with everybody. And the obstetricians had signed off on the guidelines 3 days before the MLU opened. That's why it opened after 2 years and not after 1 year. So we had no problem writing this letter. It's just the time it took to gather everything together. There were 29 items of correspondence altogether and 5 meetings. There was response from other people in support. The Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences wrote in refuting all the allegations because he knew well what was going on. The Chairperson of the Ethics Committee met with me and went through all the ethical side of it and said he was perfectly happy with everything. John Bonner, do you know, is retired, he's Professor Emeritus of Obs and Gynae in Trinity, he's well known in terms of haematology and in obstetrics and so on. He wrote man-to-man, as it were, obstetrician to medical, to the Chairman of the Medical Board in the Institute of Obs and Gynae, saying that he stood over absolutely everything of this study. The CEO actually wrote to the Dean of the Faculty of Health Sciences saying, this has nothing to do with me, I'm totally behind this study and we're delighted it's being run, and this is just some employee who's got an idea about it. The action was taken. We had a meeting with the Chairman of the Medical Board, this geriatrician, the study team, that was myself and Declan, and then John Bonner came, and it was chaired by the Deputy CEO. And the outcome of that meeting was a withdrawal of all unsubstantiated allegations, an agreement that the study was ethically sound. Now, he still had some methodological issues, and his main contention was that the study should have been powered on the APGAR score. I'm interested in the little rustle that goes around, and we talked to him and we said, well, why the APGAR score? Because it's not actually very evidence-based, and it's done by umpteen different clinicians, so it's always, you can't be sure it's the right level. And he said, no, APGAR score, must be APGAR score. And we said, well, the 5-minute APGAR score, or the 10-minute, and he said, the 7-minute. So you can imagine there was Declan and myself, 2 midwives, and John Bonner, an obstetrician, and we heard it and we went, 7 minutes? And even then he didn't give up. Yeah. So I think he hadn't had very good advice from whatever obstetrician was feeding him information. But he would not budge on that. He would not budge. So in the letter even we had to acknowledge that yes, he had this methodological disagreement where he felt it should be based on the APGAR score. He acknowledged that the allegations were false, every single one of them, and he went down and said yes, yes, yes to every one of them. They had been widely circulated and had the potential to be detrimental to the PI's career, which I don't know if you know your legal jargon, but that's the definition of slander. So he got very upset when he heard that. So he made out a full written acknowledgement of this, and it was circulated to all recipients of the previous letter. So that was a good outcome. Lessons learned from that. I was really, really grateful I'd done an RCT before and had learned some of the lessons enough to not make too many mistakes. The only mistake was not to go to this medical board, which I didn't know about, because one of his main contentions was we should have written for permission to the chairman of the medical board to start the study. But we'd had 2 years of discussions with the obstetricians and nobody had mentioned that there was a medical board there. The main lessons is you spend time, lots and lots and lots of time on preparation. You spend lots and lots of time on communication to everybody, even people you think mightn't be interested maybe. Make sure the ethical issues have been fully addressed, because there was absolutely nothing he could fault us on in everything we had. It's just he didn't know we had it, and he had been given false information about that it didn't exist, whereas it did. And not only that, it was all up on the web. You know, it was freely available to the general public at the time. So make sure the policies and procedures are 100% evidence-based. And as I said, we had done that, and they had been drawn from the ground and, you know, based on collaborative decisions, and had been sent to experts to evaluate them, so that we were absolutely sure they were okay. And the last point on that is to have a long pilot study, so that all the issues are dealt with before the main study starts. Otherwise, you're going to have to change your guidelines or change something in response to people making allegations. Now, ours was 606 women, 7 months long, which is extraordinarily long for any RCT. And that was because I had had the experience of doing an RCT before. In the Dublin third stage study, the active and physiological management one, because the midwives weren't used to doing physiological management, they had a higher PPH rate in the beginning because they were learning the technique. In the pilot study, the PPH rate was 21%. Okay? 1 in 5 women bled more than 500 mLs. And I'm amazed to this day that nobody stopped the study at that stage. But anyway, in the first month it had gone down to 18%. In the first 4 months in total it was 12%. And in the last 9 months of the study it was 6.7%. So in hindsight, if only I had kind of known that back then in the 1980s when I was doing it, I should have had maybe a pilot study of 6 months, purely for the midwives to learn what they were doing. So that's what I did with MidU. I just said, we'll have a rolling pilot study, I'm not fixing any date on it, and we'll keep going until you guys stop arguing, you know, until everybody is happy with what's happening. And all the mistakes have happened, and there's no hassle, and all these letters have been written and answered and dealt with. And then we started the study. And that was very, very useful to have that. So, last slide, Marlene, I'm just finishing. My research aims always are to improve women-centred care. And every study I do, that's what I'm aiming for. And in talking with some of you earlier on, that's what you're all aiming for too. And although carrying out RCTs and having to do all the stats and the collaboration and the talk and having to get letters like that from disgruntled geriatricians may sound like an awful lot of hassle, I have to say it's worth it all when you see the outcome. 2 MLUs up and running in Cavan and Drogheda hospitals and working very successfully. So I hope that some of those lessons that I've learned will be of use to you in the future. Thank you for your attention.